everyone, good day. For today, we are going to start our discussion of gender and society by focusing on the discussion of sex and gender. So I entitled this discussion Sex, Bodies, and Gendered Cultures because I want to emphasize on the relationship between sex and gender. Aside from differentiating it is also important that we find the value of the relationship and how they create an individual. So, by the way, I'm Leonardo Di Buyon Jr. You can call me Leo, and I'm from the College of Arts and Sciences. I intend to create this lecture in order for you not to be um, so perplexed with the concepts that we will be discussing in this class. There are different concepts in this class that are very difficult to, in a way, understand and comprehend because they are unconventional. They're not part of our activities, and these are already proven by social scientific research. And I want to show in this lecture that there are concepts that we feel like they already exist before, that they are already here, only that we are now just talking about it now. So it's not really new to us. It's really evident if you look at the society, they are already there. So the views and opinions of the instructor do not necessarily reflect the institution, since gender is a complex and uh, a very intriguing concept. This lecture will provide you a guiding framework on how to look at it as a concept. So let's begin. In this lecture, I will differentiate sex from gender, and then I will explore on the concept of gender and its development through time. I will also You will also understand the relationship between sex and gender, and then we will briefly discuss the SOGI concepts. These are the concepts that you will encounter in our future discussions on gender. And then we will examine gender stratification and sex-based inequalities using various approaches. So marami rin kasi ang mga pagtingin kung paano natin makikita yung hindi pagkakapantay-pantay ng tao sa lipunan base sa kanilang gender, makikita din natin yung mga approaches na yon. And then, we will see how social institutions contribute to the construction of gender or sexual differences and inequality. So we will look into that, how school, for instance, propagate the culture of indifference, propagate the culture of inequalities based on gender. So we will look into this. To shed light on our discussion, I put here TV personalities and people that manifest in a way gender construction and gender identity. So we are going to look into, for instance, the lives of Vice Ganda, Heidelin Diaz. I put here people who I think identify themselves different from the ideals of the society. They are those we considered as unnatural, those that we considered different, those that do not follow the principles, the traditional roles, and views on the relationship of people in society. When we talk about, for instance, masculinity, when you are a man, you are not allowed to wear makeup. You're not allowed to put decorative stuff in your face because that's considered feminine. You're not allowed to use products or skincare products because that's too feminine. And then when you're a man, you are already expected to perform extra domestic tasks. You are already expected to perform outside the confines of the home. So when a man is already inside, you're not really doing household chores. And when you do such stuff, you are considered as Andres Desaya, or you're doing the task of your wife. And a wife is considered to be only doing child nurturing and mothering skills. So they're not really, so these are the ideals that we have, the principles that society upholds, especially here in the Philippines. We also have those people who don't conform to their biological sex. So there are people who identify themselves as different from their biological sex. There are those who are born as male, but then they decide to change their identity into a woman in their coming years because they identify themselves as women. And then we also have those Um, on the other spectrum, wherein you also have female at birth, but then they decide to change their gender construction into a man. An example of that would be Jake Cyrus. So we know naman the story of Jake Cyrus, formerly known as Charisse Pempenko. So these examples provide you a glimpse of how we could look at gender in relation to the society. I also include here picture of the expectations and roles that men and women have. So when you are a man, you are expected to be masculine. And our definition, our notion of being masculine is to have a body that is like this, to have a stronger outlook in life. You're not allowed to cry. You're not allowed to show your emotions to other people. So these are the things that we are to discuss here. Ayan. So aside from those people who adhere to the notion of gender, there are those people who are against it. For instance, meron yung mga rallies about um, according to them, gender is not that important. Kids do best with a mom and dad. So they consider themselves as still believing in the traditional roles and traditional relationship between a male and a female. So, ibig sabihin lang nito, kapag gay couple ka, you are not really a good example of a family. You cannot bear child, so why adopt one? So kids do best with a mom and dad. You're not allowed to deviate from that because that's already a sin. So in our discussion of gender, of course, we are to explore on it. Gender is an inevitable part of everyday discussion. It has been there, it has always been there. But the concept has only emerged in the 1970s. So dati pa lang po, meron na po tayong konsepto ng gender and we take it for granted. Why? Because we base our moral judgments depending on our recognition of a person as a man or a woman, a girl or a boy. There is always this dichotomy between two concepts, male and female, man, woman, girl, boy. There are no gray areas. There are no other particularities. And this can be considered or believed to be so natural or part of the order of nature. But actually, they are also social construction. Male, female, girl, boy, man, or woman, they are all social constructions that we tend to identify that we use in order for us to identify themselves as ourselves in the society. So when we explore on gender, we are going to look into various social arrangements, various identification of people in society, not just these binary arrangements, in order for us to understand who we really are and how these concepts or how these structures affect our everyday lives. When we talk about gender, according to this, no one is simply a man or a woman. You are classified into male or female when you are born, but then when you go through the process of life, you are not already entitled to the idea of a man and a woman. You have to undergo the process. You have to undergo the life in a society. And gender is a social construct. When you say social construct, it is created by the society to categorize, to identify, to create structures, to create standards, categories in the society. And being a man or a woman is not a predetermined state. It's not something that is given to you at birth. You must go through the process of life as I was talking about. It is a becoming. It is a condition actively under construction. When we say actively under construction, you identify yourselves based on the existing social structures that you have. So, yung social structures natin, yung mga pinagdadaanan natin sa buhay, they are also changing. And because of these changes, because of these conditions, our idea of ourselves also changes. So there are these things in our lives that we experience that really change our outlook, that really change our identity, how we identify ourselves. And according to Simone de Beauvoir, a famous feminist, one is not born but rather becomes a woman or a man. The process that follows a gendered person has many different paths, involves many tensions and ambiguities, and produces unstable results. So, rather than focusing on the binary arrangements of being a girl or a boy, a man or a woman, the structure of life as it is, it's very complex. And life itself is complex that our identification of ourselves is also complex. There are a lot of things that we experience in our lives individually that that make us identify who we are. Pero itong identifications na ito are very different from others. But then we need to provide first a guiding framework on how we could look at sex and gender. So there are those people in the 1900s who created a distinction between sex and gender. So when we say sex now, it's not the sex in your mind that you are thinking right now. Sex is the biological and physical variables that distinguish males from females. So dito natin, ano ba yung mga determinants natin ng sex? Determinants of sex usually are your genitalia. It can either be a vagina or a penis. And of course, your type of chromosome. So yung chromosome natin, pag XX, di ba yun yung female? Pag XY, yun yung male. And when we compare that to gender, gender is actually social and cultural manifestations of being male or female in the society. So when you are born as a male, you are expected to follow the ideals of masculinity, of being male in the society. So that itself is considered as gender. So when we talk about gender, it's more on the social construct. It's more of um, the society rather than sex, which is of course more on the natural side, more on how our birth determines us as compared to gender. Ayan, so these two babies are cute. And the background, of course, when you are perceived as a male at birth, you are always given blue stuff. And when you are a female, you are given pink stuff. And this relate to our idea of gender. And then when we talk about sex, it's a biological ascription. It is given to you. It is imposed upon you. So these are the essential biological criteria that unequivocally distinguish females from males, and vice versa. And gender is an achieved status. When you say achieved status, it is something that you have to work on. It is something that you aspire to do. It is something that you identify yourself. So hindi siya na produce right away, hindi siya na-create right away. So producing and reproducing configurations of behavior that would be seen by others as normative behavior of a man or a woman. So when you are a gender, there is always a need to look at society because society imposes the ideals of masculinity and femininity. You have to perform these ideals or principles that society imposes upon you in order for you to be called such identity. And sex is fixed. You cannot fix it. It's there. It is imposed upon you. But gender is a continuous concept. It's like fluid. It is omni-relevant and unavoidable, and it involves interactional institutional processes. It is something that you experience. It is something that you go on through life. It changes through life as well. So based on the descriptions that we have a while ago, we can create a tabular form of it in order to differentiate sex and gender. So what are the things that we have to highlight here? Yung sa sex, of course, it's destiny. You don't have a choice. God gives it to us. When you are born as a female, wala ka namang choice, wala ka namang option na Lord, ayoko po nitong sex ko, gusto ko po maging lalaki. And then, sa gender, we are going to talk about the rainbow community here because the rainbow community identifies themselves different from the traditional concepts of man and woman. So, gender is an acquired identity, it changes over time and varies widely across cultures. And it is something that is relational. So, when we talk about gender, it is important to look at it as a relational concept because it involves how men treat women and how women treat men, and how societal structures influence the way they treat each other. So, in order to define gender, we must look at its historical context. So, the term gender has become common in English language discussions only in the 1970s. So, it's always there. It was always there from the beginning, but then the construction of gender only started in the 1970s. So before, the idea of gender is always differentiated and dichotomized with sex. So lagi silang pinaghihiwalay ng mga konsepto. And however, that became so problematic. Why? Bakit yung diniscuss natin kanina na pagda-dichotomize ng sex and gender ay pangit or hindi magandang argumento patungkol sa pagtingin sa gender? Number one, human life does not simply divide into two realms, nor does human character divide into two types. So when we talk about the divide kasi between sex and gender using the dichotomy that we have created, we tend to not include the struggles of those people who do not adhere to the biological criteria that are imposed upon them. So 'di ba sa discussion natin kanina, um, kapag sex, it's all about biological, and then gender, it's all about performing the tasks that are imposed on you based on your biological criteria. But there are those people who do not adhere to that. They should not be based on the dichotomy in difference because there are, for instance, female assigned at birth, but then they decide to do masculine stuff. Number two, a definition in terms of difference means that where we cannot see difference, we cannot see gender. So, yun, yung pagkakasabi ko pa lang kanina, when you say difference, hindi natin nakikita yung struggles ng mga other members of the society that do not adhere to the traditional roles of being a girl and a boy. A definition based on dichotomy excludes the differences among women and among men from the concept of gender. And then any definition in terms of personal characteristics excludes processes which lie beyond the individual person. There are experiences that only an individual can experience. So although you consider yourself or categorize yourself as a gay, as a lesbian, a man, or a woman, there are things that you have to consider that are different from your experiences as a gay person than the experiences of another gay person as well. And this is because of social science. During the advent of science kasi only, we always incorporate our identity based on sex. So dalawa lang talaga. But because of social science, we now look at it as relational, as living in a spectrum. When we look at when we define gender, it is a matter of the social relations within which individuals and group act. It must be understood as a social structure, a pattern in our social arrangements and the everyday activities or practices which those arrangements govern. It must be a social construct. It must exist in the society in order for us to identify ourselves. Yan. Papasok na dito yung discussion natin on the relationship between sex and gender. It's very important for us not to differentiate sex and gender alone. We must also look into how they relate to each other, how they create a sense of an individual. So gender also involves a specific relationship with the bodies. Bodies, this of course relate to sex. Society addresses bodies and deals with reproductive processes and differences among bodies. So you have here an idea of sex, and that is of course your body. Your body is already given to you at birth. But then that body is put into a cultural arena, into a gendered culture, wherein that body will undergo a lot of changes depending on the structures that are available. So that is the relationship between sex and gender. You are already given a body, you don't have a choice. But then, the choice is already there when you put that body into a cultural arena. When you put that body, for instance, in a patriarchal society, what happens to the body as a woman? Of course, yung body na yon ay nagagamit into a decorative purpose, into something that is used by men. Kasi pag babae ka sa patriarchal na lipunan, wala silang pakialam sa'yo. Kapag halimbawa, um, bakla ka, you identify yourself as gay, but then into, you are born as a male. But there are structures in a society that you like, and these structures tend to identify or shape you into someone na bakla. And this is the idea of gender. We have to look at a body first in order for us to identify it. There must be a body first. And gender arrangement is always in fact changing. It is in the process of constant changing. Nagbabago ang ating lipunan, therefore nagbabago rin ang pagtingin natin sa ating gender arrangement. So, kung dati mababa ang tingin sa babae, ngayon ba maaari nating sabihin na mataas na ang tingin sa kanila o ganun pa din? And when we look at gender, there are various dimensions that we have to consider. Marami tayong mga bagay na dapat pinag-aaralan patungkol dito. Examples of this include, for instance, the intersex. These are the people who are born with some combination of male and female characteristics. So ito yung mga tao na merong chromosomes similar to both male and female. O diba? Kung sex ay biological, bakit may mga ganitong bagay? Bakit may mga deviations? And then we also have transsexuals, you know them, people who are born with the body of one sex but they feel that they belong to the opposite sex. These are people who identify themselves different from their biological ascription. And then you also have transvestite. These are the people who dress in opposite gender clothes. So ito yung mga tao na usually nagda-drug, I mean you're changing your, parang they're trying to challenge the conventional setup of wearing clothes, yung mga norms na yan, sa pagsusuot ng damit. May mga lalaki, especially Harry Styles, I specifically remember Harry Styles and Darren Criss because these Hollywood personalities are able to transcend their masculinity beyond the clothes that they wear. So itong mga to, nagka-crop top pa ata sila. Basta ang dami nilang ginagawang deviations and these are considered as transvestites. And then you also have transgender or people who feel that they are neither male nor female but somewhere in between. So these are the mga transgenders natin. And they are different from transsexuals because transsexuals already had an idea of who they are as persons. Now we ask ourselves, since we know that gender is a social construction and sex is something that is imposed on us, can sex be a social construct too? So, guguluhin na naman natin ang ating pag-iisip dito because according to Butler, both sex and gender are socially constructed and treats femininity and masculinity as established by normative regulative behavior. Example of this would be Caster Semenya. She is a consistent Olympian. She is assigned cisgender woman, a female at birth. Pero meron siyang chromosomes that are also male. So pwede natin siyang i-identify as an intersexual. But then she identifies herself as a cisgender woman. Ibig sabihin, babae siya. And there are arguments against this because when she participated in the Olympics, She would break records. She would be the front runner. Yun. Kasi iba naman talaga yung qualities ng pagiging lalaki at sa pagiging babae in terms of strengths, physical strengths and weaknesses. And I think, in a way, she used that to her advantage. So ano ang issue dito? Should we consider her? Should she participate in the next Olympics? Or dapat siyang i-disqualified because of that? So yun yung mga bagay dito. And sex is a social construct here in a sense that she identified herself as a female, as a cisgender woman. Kasi out of the plurality, out of the um, identifications or qualities that she has within herself. We learn to act manly or womanly based on the sex that we're born into and society's expectation of that sex. That's true. Sabi ko nga, there is a need for a body first. When we look at sex and gender, the relationship here, pinanganak ka na may katawan ka, may ari ka, may type of chromosome ka. And that is something that is biological. But it doesn't really determine you as a person entirely because you have to go on the process of life to understand or in a way create your idea of gender identity. How you identify yourself is based on the expectations of that society from that sex. And there are those people who deviate from these expectations. There are those who follow and there are those who deviate. So aside from looking at it, we have to look into how gender is theorized. So there are those people who believe that gender is purely a social construction. So there is no need for us to identify sex. Because gender is a social construction. Wala siyang pakialam sa sex. There are those people, like me, who believe that gender reflects sex and sex restricts gender. When you are born, for instance, as a male, there is this expectation upon you to be masculine. But there are those people who deviate from that, and that's okay. Sex mirrors gender as something culturally constructed, and gender could be the causal result of sex or can be the multiple interpretations of sex. You must begin with a sex. You must begin with an identification biologically, and then you will proceed into the process of life to identify who you are as a person, and that is considered gender construction. And Butler would create this statement, you may read it, pero that's what I'm saying a while ago. So, what should we consider? Is it nature or nurture? For the individual, according to Lorber, gender construction starts with assignment to a sex category on the basis of what the genitalia look like at birth, as I was saying a while ago. An example of how we can look at gender construction would be the case of Agnes. It was studied by Garfinkel in 1967, and itong case na ito is actually about Agnes, who was a transsexual raised as a boy who adopted female identity and underwent sex reassignment operation. So, lalaki siya nung pinanganak siya biologically, and then she would soon identify herself as a woman, and she had to undergo a lot of things in order for her to be called as a woman. So what can we infer from here? Ano ba yung mga bagay na dapat nating malaman? Gender requires a skill in sustaining a process of doing it. You have to undergo through a process, a circumstance, in order for you to pass through an a conception of who you are as a person. And then, with that, it's not something that is fixed. Therefore, Agnes needs to acquire necessary skills in order to do gender and display femininity. Ano ba yung mga bagay na ginagawa ng mga babae na dapat gawin din ni Agnes para matawag siyang babae? Producing their gender is a product of legitimizing aspects from social institutions and interactions in everyday activities. At masasabi natin na ang lipunan natin ay meron na itong mga set of standards or criteria na nakapaloob kung paano nito tinitingnan ang babae at ang lalaki. So ano ang ginawa ni Agnes? When it came to sex, Agnes did not possess the socially agreed upon biological criteria for classification as a member of the female sex. because of course, her penis. And the penis, she insisted, was a mistake in need of a remedy. There are people who think that um, yung biological ascription nila ay pagkakamali ng nature and it should be addressed through culture. And Kessler and McKenna would say that genitalia are conventionally hidden from public inspection in everyday life. Yet we continue through our social rounds to observe a world of two naturally normally sexed persons. Against this idea of um, but against this idea of the bipolarity of men and women is the notion of Kessler and McKinney. Ang sinasabi lang naman nila dito, bakit yung genitalia natin yung magde-determine kung sino tayo bilang mga tao? Eh, tinatago nga natin ito, di ba, in public. Hiyang-hiya nga tayo na ipakita ito sa mga tao. Bakit yun yung magde-determine sa atin bilang mga tao? Di ba? Joke lang, ayan. Pero yun yung sinasabi nila doon. That would be the argument of Kessler and McKenna. Di ba totoo naman? Meron bang tao? Except na lang kung porn star ka, di ba? Pag porn star ka, syempre, trabaho mo yun na ipakita. The act of sex categorization relies on the if-can test in everyday interaction. So, based on the case of Agnes, if people can be seen her as member of a relevant category, which is female or a woman, then she must be categorized as such. She has to perform a lot of activities, though, in order for her to be identified as such. So by attending to the criticism of her fiancé, for instance, she was able to produce configurations of behavior that were seen by others as normative gender behavior or as normal. In order for her to be perceived as naturally a normal female, she must undergo a lot of things. What are these things? Mag-makeup, magsuot ng pambabae, mag-undergo ng sex reassignment operation, kailangan niya din na wag masyadong magsalita on her political views because women before were not allowed to do that. Kailangan mahinhin siya, kailangan submissive siya sa fiancé niya, kailangan di siya nakikipag-argue. So yun yung mga bagay na ginawa niya. At yung pinaka nakakatawa sa ginawa niya dati, since lalaki siya dati, sanay siya na magubad-hubad, di ba, ng kanyang hindi siya nagwe-wear ng bra. So, na-adapt niya yon. Tapos nakita siya ng mga kapitbahay niya, sinaway siya ngayon ng kanyang fiancé. Hindi daw yun ginagawa ng babae. So therefore, what can we say about gender? Gender is constructed continually and produced through markers and activities related to being a man or a woman. So there is definitely standards that they have to follow in order for them to um, to be identified as such. So, for instance, for Lorber, as identified by the case of Agnes as a transsexual, transsexuals and transvestites construct gender status by dressing, speaking, walking, gesturing in the ways prescribed for women or men, whichever they want to be taken for, and so gender as in any normal person. For instance, Vice Ganda, you would know him from, of course, different variety shows in ABS-CBN. So, yan yung ginagawa niya. I don't know how to identify him or her, pero she would go to the set wearing the clothes of a woman. And yun, dati din yung ginagawa. So, these are the things that we have to look into, the complexities of life. And this can be considered as gender display. Gender is such a familiar part of daily life that it usually takes a deliberate disruption of our expectations of how women and men are supposed to act to pay attention to how it is produced. Gender signs and signals are so ubiquitous, then we are comfortable until we have successfully placed the other person in a gender status, otherwise we feel socially dislocated. There are people who portray their gender based on the clothes that they wear, based on their actions. So, yun yung tinatawag nating gender display. When you are a man, you portray yourself as masculine, but there are those people as well who do not display their gender. And that's okay. It's not required for us to display our gender. It's not required for us to show ourselves or to identify ourselves as someone who has this and that to the public. It is something that is only with us, and it's also a personal decision. If gender must be defined as the socially constructed correlates of sex, then gender display relates to conventional portrayals of these correlates. So gender display is always connected with sex because sex determines what we wear, how we act, the expectations of our society. Yun, pinapakita yun sa atin ng yung assignment natin through sex. Scripted dramatization of the cultural idealization of feminine and masculine natures, how masculine and feminine are portrayed, and then these are of course optional. You are not obliged to manifest this in the society. As stated in the case of Agnes, there is a sex category and it is different from gender because the sex category is something that is tested. So kapag pasok ka dito, yun ka. Gender is hence the collective manifestations of its precursors, sex, sex category, and gender display. This is what I am talking about when we look at the relationship between sex and gender because sex is a component of gender. So nagsisimula palagi sa sex and when you move it into the cultural arena, that sex or that body becomes gendered. Ano ba tong gender identity na to na palagi natin sinasabi? Gender identity is the internal sense of being a man or a woman or something else. Ito yung idea mo kung sino ka as a person. You can either identify yourself as a cis man or a man, a cis woman, or something else, as a member of the rainbow community, for instance. And then, this is independent of your person's birth assigned sex, physical characteristics, initial gender orientation, or sexual orientation. So, although they are related, they are not interdependent. So, ibig sabihin, hindi necessarily since it is very complex, hindi necessarily na naaapektuhan ng birth assigned sex mo yung pagkatao mo as a person because that's two different things. An example of this would be an interview. So, tinanong kasi siya kung gaano siya kabakla and there's no such thing. Yan, how gay are you from 1 to 10? I don't think gayness can be ranked like that. 'Di ba? Parang napaka-offensive naman yan if you are a gay person and an interviewer would ask you kung gaano ka kabakla. Nakaka-offend, di ba? And that is because of the gender-bread person. So, in this gender-bread person, we would look at how complex we can identify ourselves. So, this is the one that I got from the internet, pero may mas magandang portrayal nito. There are 4 components of a person: gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. So dito na papasok yung ideya natin ng SOGI. If you're familiar with the sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, SOGI yon. And ito yon. When we talk about gender identity, as we are saying a while ago, nire-represent yung mind natin because it is our identification of ourselves internally. So you can identify yourself as a cis man or cis woman. But there is also another identification that deviates from the traditional expectations of being a man and a woman, and that is what we call genderqueer. When we talk about genderqueer, the rainbow community belongs to the genderqueer category because these are the people who identify themselves deviating from the traditional expectations of the society. So pag cis man ka, you identify yourself as a man, cis woman, woman, and then gender, queer, the rainbow community. It's all in the mind when we talk about gender identity. In gender expression, it represents our movement. Kaya yun yung nilagay dyan na figure, your movement, expression, how you act, how you portray yourself in public, how you dress, how you talk, all of that. You can either be masculine, you can either be feminine, and you can be different or androgynous. And of course, biological sex is all about our physical body, and you can either be male or female. And then there are also people who are intersex, as we have stated a while ago. Sexual orientation as well is here as is part of the discussion because sexual orientation relates to your heart. Kanino ka in love? Kanino ka nalilibugan, for instance? Kanino ka nagkakaroon ng sense of attachment? If you have connection with a similar biological sex, then you are probably a homosexual. And then you are a heterosexual when you believe or when you are attached to a different biological sex. Kapag pareho, definitely bisexual ka. So, ito yung mga bagay that we have to look into in order for us to have a complexity of our lives. So, ano ba yung governing principle dito? Your gender identity is independent from your expression, sex, and orientation. You can be a man and act in a feminine way. 'Di ba? Pwede ka namang maging lalaki, pero umiiyak ka. Pwede ka namang maging lalaki tulad ni Harry Styles. He identifies herself as a cis man, but he wears in a feminine way, and that's okay. There are those people who perceive themselves as male at birth, but then when we talk about gender identity, they identify themselves as part of the gender queer. And there are also women, for instance, or men who fall in love with their similar sex. And that's okay. That's part of the soji. That's part of the categorization or the complexities in our society. With famous example of this would be the relationship of Vice Ganda and Ayon Perez. Ayon Perez considers himself as a cis man. But then, he fell in love with a gay or a transgender like Vice Ganda who acts in a feminine way. But Ayon also acts, but Ayon on the other hand acts in a masculine way, and then he falls in love in a homosexual way. So what can we say about this? The complexity of gender construction. So ano ba yung mga bagay that we can infer from this? When we talk about sex, ito ay nilalaman batay sa katangiang biological. Ang gender ay social construction, pagkakilala mo sa sarili mo. Cisgender, if you are part of the divide between man and woman, cisgender ka. Pero pag transgender ka or transsexual ka, you are part of the gender queer. Trans man, trans woman. And ang inyong sexual orientation at gender identity ay magkaiba. They are also independent from each other. Meaning, you can fall in love with someone who has a similar sex regardless whether you identify yourself as a cis man. Yun po. They are independent from each other. And sexual orientation, kanino ka na-in-love, kanino ka nalilibugan. Kapag na-identify mo na yung self mo na ganon, and yun yung lalabas doon. Ayan, we also have here concepts that we have to look into. Heterosexuality is the concept to refer to men attracted to women, women attracted to men. Ito yung traditional concept natin, traditional notion of society. Lalaki, babae, babae, lalaki nag-inlove sa isa't isa. And that is something that is normal, natural, or default in a society. It is what we call heteronormativity. But there are those people, like lesbian and gay, who are attracted and sexually attached to their similar sex. They are the lesbian and the gay, and we also have the bisexual who are attracted romantically to both men and women. Transsexuals, as we have stated a while ago, people whose assigned sex differs from their gender identity, like Jake Zyrus, like Kevin Balot, itong mga trans women and trans men natin. And On the argument, for instance, of gender, they are considered as women because they identify themselves as such and they follow the idealizations, the portrayals of what women are in the society. So in the argument of this course, they are considered as women because it's not something that is already imposed upon females. You should act, you should perform it, and you should perform it, and they are already performing it. And the process of doing that is what we call transition. Sex, sex-free assignment operation, way of dressing, yung pagpunta sa ganito ganyan, magme-makeup, fall in love with someone ay part ng transition period. Intersex, as we have stated, transvestite, and transgender, they are all part of the complexities of these SOGI concepts. Now, why do societies gender? We are now using gender not just not just as a noun, not just as an adjective, but also as a verb. Bakit ginagamit how do societies gender? Bakit kailangan ng society mag-gender? Bakit kailangan niya i-classify yung mga tao sa lipunan? Gender is like the routine ground of everyday activities. There are a set of expectations imposed on us. And gender is, of course, a social institution. And as a social institution, it organizes human societies. It is a need for a society to impose gender on us in order for us to have a sense of purpose in society. Parang meron kasing sense of division of labor when we talk about gender, di ba? Na parang it is determined that when you are a man, you have to perform this task, and when you are a woman, you have to perform this following task. So, kailangan yun. Kailangan ng society mag-gender para masustain niya yung sarili niya. Every society universally follows gender and age grades to classify people and assign them to different roles and responsibilities in every society. Yan po, redundant. And then, yan, they have to learn to act and react in expected ways and thus construct and maintain the gender order. And that begins at birth until adulthood. For instance, when you are a woman, when you are a female at birth, you are already treated as of your mother as the next mother. So you have to perform child nurturing, you have to do household chores because it is expected of you to perform such roles in order for you to classify as someone who is a woman. So therefore, social construction of gender begins at birth until adulthood. And then Butler analyzes this as a gender identity, as we have stated a while ago. And then gender norms and expectations are enforced through informal sanctions or formal punishments by authorities should individuals deviate from the socially imposed standards for men and women. So why do societies gender? In order to organize societies. But there are people like the gender queer who identify themselves different from those. And they are actually treated differently by society. Pag legal institution, usually, pag legal frameworks na law, ang mga genderqueer people, they are not accepted by the law. Kasalanan ang tingin. Religion, for instance, would look at being a part of the genderqueer as a sin to God, na you're not going to heaven. And then there are also in Muslim societies wherein genderqueer is treated as a sin and they are not allowed to participate in the society. They are not allowed to do civic affairs. And that's the legal framework. In the informal institutions naman, like families, ganyan, they are always, ano ba dito, in isolation. Parang lagi silang, hindi belong. Parang hindi sila nagmamatter sa lipunan. And that's because they're not following the ideals of the society. Should they follow, even though their heart doesn't want that? Gender as a process means there is a room for modification and variation by individuals and small groups, but also for institutionalized change. It is therefore necessary that we try to improve, to create rooms for improvement in the institutions that we have in society. So in order for us to cater to the differences, to the various differences in our society, especially on our gender identity, we must create changes. So how do we create changes? We include them in policy making. We include them, we accept them, we treat them as fellow human beings rather than excluding them, rather than treating them as someone who is different, who will not go to heaven, who will be this and that, makasalanan, yung mga bagay na ganon. Because material pleasures are also enjoyed by man and woman, and genderqueer people also deserve that. Aside from this, there are also gender stereotypes assigned not just to genderqueer people but also, of course, especially to man and woman. Societies also assign expectations that could either expand or limit men's and women's opportunities for work, education, and political activities. When you are a man or a male, you are perceived to do this. When you are a woman, you are perceived to do this and that. And these preconceived ideas, whereby males and females are arbitrarily assigned characteristics and roles determined and limited by their sex, although there is a process of gender construction here, you are only limited and determined by your sex. So kapag babae ka, dapat nasa bahay ka lang. Kapag lalaki ka, ang expectation sa'yo dapat mag-work ka, hindi ka dapat patamad-tamad kasi ikaw ang padre de pamilya. Ikaw ang pundasyon ng bahay ninyo. Pag babae ka, ikaw ang ilaw ng tahanan, ikaw dapat ang binding mechanism ng family ninyo. And these are preconceived ideas that we have to analyze. And should we try to debunk them now in the contemporary world that we are living in? Are they productive still? Productive pa rin ba to? Itong mga stereotypes na ito? Kasi pag sinabing babae, ang pagtingin sa'yo, hindi ka magaling sa engineering, hindi ka magaling sa math. Kapag lalaki ka, hindi ka magaling sa grammar, hindi ka magaling sa English. Those kinds of things manifest gender stereotypes. And because of these gender stereotypes, we also have a stratification now. Asymmetry. When we talk about asymmetry, the treatment of people in society is now unequal. In many societies and in the history of the world, in a gender stratified society, what men do is usually more valued than what women do. Women are always neglected in the society. Admit it or not, it is already a structural problem that we need to address right now. Men are always identified as strong, while women are considered as vulnerable. And this sex-based inequality exists in the society and we must accept that. Women are treated differently. Women are not given opportunities in the workplace, in their careers, in their personal growth. As while men enjoy the pleasures, the material pleasures of life. When sex is fundamental basis for social stratification, whether one is female or male, then sex-based inequality exists. When we talk about sex-based inequalities, this arise from the unequal distribution of three kinds of valued commodities or scarce rewards of production. Ito yung mga bagay na dapat nating tandaan kung bakit nagkakaroon ng inequalities. Number one is power, political, wealth, and prestige. So it's more of the political, economic, and social. Men obtain a more dominant position because of their productive capacity in food provision, distribution, and other extra-domestic roles. So since sila yung nag-work sa labas, so sila yung may deserve na na may power, wealth, and prestige. Women traditionally are stuck into domestic roles such as lactation and nurturing of children. And these sex-based inequalities is stipulated in most industrialized societies based on the account of Richardson and Taylor. You can read on that. But there are also perceptions and perspectives on women's subordination. Bakit ba mababa ang tingin sa babae sa lipunan? Merong mga positions dyan. Number one, number one. Number one is Ortner. When we talk about Ortner, medyo symbolist kasi siya. More on the cultural side si Ortner. he would base or he would base um, sexual differences, inequalities on physiological and social roles. So, sabi niya, women's subordination daw is a universal phenomenon. It's not contextually located, and that women is associated to nature, which is fixed, while men is culture, which is superior to the natural world. Pag women ka, para kang mother nature. Kaya nga ang tawag sa nature natin ay mother because it is already fixed. You cannot do anything about it. While culture is associated to men because culture is constantly changing and adapting to the forces of history. And this is superior to the natural world according to Ortner. And we also have Rosaldo. Rosaldo would create an account of the subordination of women based on their roles. So, motherhood is a natural process, while fatherhood is something that is achieved. So, domestic siya. Ibig sabihin, pag babae ka, it is something that is imposed on you, while men's life is public. You have to, there are a lot of expectations for men than women because men are outside the confines of the home. They have to go into the transitions of rank, they have to organize and subsume particular mother-child groups. So, kaya yon marami rin tayong sa women subordination, magandang tingnan dito yung pagtingin ng mga lalaki sa mga sarili nila kasi sobrang taas ng expectation sa mga lalaki, guys. At minsan, ito ay nakasasama na sa kanilang mental health or physical body because they're not allowed to cry in front of the public. They're not allowed to show their emotions because these are considered as um, forms of vulnerability and they cannot show that. From the Marxist feminist perspective, it is from the economic take. So, pag pinag-uusapan natin yung economic take, women are seen as material as a source for material production. Tinitingnan ang mga babae bilang mga bagay lamang. Sila ay powerless because they have become the property of the capitalist. Paano ba yun? So, pag property ka ng capitalist, sila usually yung mga sexual toys ng mga mayayaman, sila yung nagpe-perform ng mga activity sa bahay. Di ba nga in a traditional setup, sa panapapanood natin yung teleserye, pag yung businessman ay may asawa, usually yung asawa hindi niya mahal, may anak sila pero hindi niya mahal, tapos expected na yung asawa yung gumagawa ng mga ginagawa sa gawaing bahay. And this is because of the light of the capitalist industrialist setup of the society. They are treated as cheap and exploitable reserve army of labor. Paggawa lang sila. And from the industrialist perspective naman, men usually do food producing while women must bear and suckle the children. So parang ito kay Uber, para rin siyang kay Rosaldo na nakafocus sa rules. Since men yung nagpo-produce ng food, dapat sila yung may decision on how to manage the family as compared to the women who only bear and suckle the children. Ang hirap kaya mag-alaga ng bata, di ba? Tapos hindi nila yun na-appreciate. Ayan. Women are confined in domestic duties of child rearing, so their contribution of food production is reduced. So nakadetermined yung value ng isang tao sa family based on the amount of or the value of food production he or she contributes. So kung may nabibigay ka, edi ikaw yung may say sa family. Pero because of the advent now of the contemporary world, iba na yun ngayon. The increase in the level of education and employment for women also increase their share in the family income. So should we say na since meron ng contribution sa food production ang mga babae, dapat meron na rin silang say sa sinasabi ng mga tao sa lipunan? May karapatan na ba silang magsalita patungkol sa kanilang mga pamilya dahil meron na silang ambag sa pagkain nila sa lipunan? And this um, stratifications, these inequalities that our family and our society give to us is actually created by social institutions. So in this time, we are to look into how institutions contribute to the construction of gender and sexual differences or inequalities. So titingnan natin dito yung mga institutions and socialization processes na meron sa mga institutions na ito. So how do we learn gender roles? We actually learn gender roles or responsibilities as people here in the world based on our interaction with our family members, our schoolmates, our friends, our religious members, our workplace colleagues, and the media itself. The pink world and the blue world. When we are born, our parents would give us things that are associated with our categorization as either male or female. So may nakita na ba kayong family na kapag ang anak na lalaki ay lalaki, binibigyan ng mga pink na mga bagay? Siyempre magagalit yung tatay doon. Because it is naturally perceived that when you are a man, when you are a boy, you live in the blue world. As compared to a woman who starts from the pink world. So, ito yung gender schema natin. Paano nakikreate ng bata yung gender niya? So, child observes males and females at first, and then child appropriates gender behavior. Child imitates appropriate gender behavior. So, nakikita nung bata sa tatay niya, kunwari, o sa mga, kung wala man siyang tatay, sa mga father figures niya sa bahay kung paano mag-act as a man. Therefore, ginagaya niya yon. And then, the society would reward a child by doing that. So, binavalidate ng society ngayon. Oo, ganyan. Ganyan dapat, ganyan dapat. And then, the child becomes a gendered type. There are also some instances when a child imitates inappropriate gender behavior. So, pag lalaki ka, and then nakita mo yung mga tao sa bahay, yung mga babae doon, ginagaya mo yung ginagawa nila. And the society punishes you for that by through discrimination or through legal means kung sobra na talaga. But then the child itself also becomes a gender type person. And those are the struggles of people who identify themselves as the gender queer. So may mga tao talaga na ganito, and that's part of the gender schema. So similar lang din yun sa baba. In terms of religion, societies can distinguish males and females in the context of religion in a way that they treat women's bodies as impure and thus women remain excluded from several spheres of life. I would say that this is evident in the Catholic Church because the Catholics would say that the women's body are full of sin. Kasi nga 'di ba si Eve yung parang naging source ng sin ni Adam, and that's because of the nature of being a woman. So ganun yung pagtingin ng religion. Biblical foundations of being a man and a woman. The Bible itself was written by men and they would depict women in a different way. So when you try to look at the Bible using a feminist perspective, you would arrive at an interpretation of women as deprived, as people who are full of sin, as people who are different, as people who should be treated as decorative only in the society. So yun yung pagtingin ng religion sa babae at sa lalaki. Admit it or not, ganun na ganun siya. I, I, I still have not encountered a religion that treats men and women equally. May nakita na ba kayong religion na ang nagsasalita ay babae? If meron, pakisabi sa akin. Paki-comment na lang. Ayan. And then, our families, as stated a while ago, shape who we are as well. How we construct our gender is shaped by our family members. In a traditional societies, or even now in the contemporary world, male offsprings are more valued as and while women are treated as temporary members with uncertain roles. 'Di ba? Ang lalaki kasi yung nagdadala ng pangalan. At yung babae, usually yung umaalis sa bahay kapag nag-asawa na siya. And in China, for instance, foot binding is practiced to preserve the female virginity and control rich women's behavior. Is there such a thing called foot binding that is practiced by men? Di ba wala naman? because these are expectations who are given to women na para masunod nila kung ano yung provided for them ng society, dapat ginagawa nila ito. And then in India, the custom of sati, I don't know how to pronounce this, gives power for the male relatives over children and land. So in the Philippine society, what can you say about the differences that the male and female offsprings are given to in their during and after their childbirth? So, 'di ba yung babae kapag pinapagalitan palagi kapag hindi marunong sa gawaing bahay, kapag lalaki okay lang, sige maglaro ka lang diyan, okay lang 'yan kasi in the near future um, siya yung magtatanggol, siya yung magiging padre de pamilya, siya yung magbibigay ng pera sa pamilya. And I have encountered this myself in my own household kasi my sister would always be required to do household chores. Tas sa akin parang hindi kasi but the responsibility to bear our family, to produce a lineage, those kinds of things are expected to perform for men. In terms of economy, we can say that the men are those who contribute to the economy of a nation because they are given more opportunities in the workplace as compared to women who are only conformed to do child nurturing and mothering. So kapag lalaki ka, ikaw usually yung may opportunities ng workplace while women are only confined in the confines of the home. Um, for instance, in the book of Men and Women in the Corporation by Cantor, he criticized the absence of gender awareness in organization research and showed how gender issues even mattered for the minority of women who did not make it into the corporate hierarchy. So in the corporate world, usually, mas tinitingnan ang mga lalaki as compared sa mga babae. And then, Glucksmann in Women on the Line would argue that women were employed in low-paid routine jobs only. Promotion was block. Men could get twice the wage for doing easier jobs. And it was obvious that the only qualification you needed for a better job was to become a man. Hindi mo kailangan maging skilled woman para mag-excel sa buhay. Kailangan mo lang talaga maging lalaki. Kaya nga 'di ba may kanta si Taylor Swift na The Man? Kasi dahil may double standards yung lipunan natin. I'm so sick of running. Char. Kumakanta ko. When we look at politics, in history, there is already a terrain of the exclusion of women because of how the state operates. So the state is the core of the wider structure of power relations and gender. And we can say that when we talk about the state, it actually perpetuates an idea of sex-based inequalities. Before, women were not allowed to vote. Before, women were not allowed to participate in civic affairs. They were not given opportunities to say their opinions on matters that are of prime importance in society. So there is an overall gender division of labor, with men concentrated in departments such as the military, police, infrastructure, and economic agencies, while women are concentrated in social welfare, health, and education. Even though women were now given opportunities in the society, what we can say is that there is this stereotype attached to them. They're not allowed to do physical strengths and stuff like that in terms of their choice of career. Kasi lagi lang sila dun sa mga child nurturing, child rearing activities, mothering, which include or which reflect social welfare, health, and education. And that is because of the categories of husband and wife. And the state perpetuates that. 'Di ba? Meron yung pag kinakasal, may responsibilidad ang pagiging husband at pagiging wife. And that already shows um, how gender is constructed. So, wag na kayong mag-asawa. Mamatay na lang tayo mag-isa. Joke. Ayan. But because of the rise of the liberal state, because of the democratic thinking, we now create a world wherein women were allowed to do such and such. Ito yung parang napakagandang nangyari sa mundo natin kasi parang nabigyan ng pagtingin ang issue ng gender, specifically yung mga struggles ng mga babae sa lipunan. And yeah, we can already proceed because these are already manifestations of what we have discussed a while ago. So, this is another concept that Connell posits. Connell would argue that when we talk about gender regime, it is a person whose gender is clear, must assume clear roles to fulfill his everyday social relations. So, para magkaroon tayo ng idea kung sino tayo, we must undergo through these social institutions. And these social institutions frame our way of action. Hence, at the end, we now continue to identify ourselves based on these contributions of our societal institutions. And this create gender stereotypes that we have discussed a while ago. Kapag babae, more on the shopping, kapag ang iniisip, shopping, fantasy, puro chocolate, chismis. Di ba pag babae lagi iniisip chismis, machismosa sila. Ang mga babae kapag magkakaibigan yung mga yan, tapos may jowa sila, lagi nila pinag-uusapan yung mga jowa nila. As compared sa mga lalaki na puro video games at babae yung pinag-uusapan, these are gender stereotypes that we should debunk. Because they are counterproductive, they do not reflect the complexity of human life. And when you are a woman, there is a biased attitude towards you. Nag-iinarte ka lang. Hindi yan totoo. Kung lalaki ka, ma-experience mo yung ganito. Pero pag babae ka, ganyan ka talaga. Um, Na-rape ka? Sure ka na na-rape ka? Sure ka na nakatingin ako sa'yo? Nagpapapansin ka lang naman eh. Ikaw naman nagsimula kasi ikaw yung unang tumingin. Ito yung mga halimbawa ng mga bagay na na-experience ng mga babae sa lipunan natin. Ikaw na ngayon ang catcall, ikaw na ngayon na catcall bilang babae, ikaw pa yung may kasalanan. 'Di ba? Sorry ah. Sorry guys. And this also leads to discrimination. And this is an action against a group of people. In terms of the workplace, kapag babae ka, you are given more high. In my experience, as someone who does not classify to man or woman, I would always look at employees na babae na binibigyan sila ng high regard kapag yung boss ay lalaki. Tapos kapag ganito ka, they would mock you, they would try to ridicule you, they would look at you as a joke. Parang ganun na kasi yung ideal notion of being someone like this. And of course, that's what you call gender discrimination. And as we have said a while ago, meron tayong mga examples nito, yung mga discrimination, stereotypes, yan. And of course, the views and opinions of the instructor do not necessarily reflect those of the institution. It was evident, it is always evident in the speeches of our president, Rodrigo Duterte, on how, of regarding how he portrays women in his mind. So, I was angry that she was raped. Yes, that was one thing. But she was so beautiful. I think the mayor should have been first. What a waste. So, parang ito yung isa sa mga examples nung um, may pinatay na babae and sana daw nauna siya. O, diba, that's kind of a sexist joke. I don't really like these kinds of jokes kasi um, they're taking into account women and I don't like people taking advantage of how women portray themselves. Sayang beautiful rape women, as I have stated a while ago. At syempre maraming naniniwala dito, maraming mga lalaki ang masyadong believe sa sarili nila na parang ang tingin nila sa babae ay decoration. Na kapag nakarami ka ng sex, na kapag nakarami ka ng natikman, nalasahan tuloy, parang yun na yun. Yun yung maganda. Yun yung determinant mo of who you are as a man. Masisisi ba natin sila? We will look on that in the coming discussions. And then, sexist jokes on men. How men sort their laundry. Di ba pag, ang typical na idea ng lalaki, magulo. Sa dorm, I tried, I had an experience of a dorm when I was in college and it was really dreadful because we were all men. We were all males in the room and ang gulo-gulo talaga, I swear. And this is a sexist joke for us kasi, yan, tinan mo. What 10 things no men about women and they only care about boobs. That's a sexist joke against men. Kasi may mga lalaki naman, di ba, na hindi tumitingin sa physical na anyo ng mga babae. Meron ba? Sumagot kayo kung meron. Kung wala, edi wow. Example of sexist jokes on LGBTQIA community would be the statements of Kevin Hart and ayaw niyang paglaruin yung anak niya sa sa dollhouse ng kanyang mga um, daughters kasi that will deviate from the standard or the expectation na dapat ginagawa ng father sa kanyang lalaking anak. Ayaw niyang maging bakla yung anak niya in a sense. And that's a sexist joke on the LGBT community. As a straight male, how would you feel about your child having a homosexual school teacher who they're around for 8 hours a day? This is very offensive in my part because we don't, our, our gender identity, our sexual orientation do not affect our way of thinking as human beings, do not affect how we treat other people. We are just like this, but we can also be human beings. We can also be teachers. And that's also similar to all of us. We have to realize that. If a gay teacher teaches my child the difference between there, and there, I'm good. Ang masasabi ko lang, thank you. And another important concept, the last concept that we will discuss this lecture would be intersectionality. When we try to look at intersectionality, I'd like you to create an idea in your mind. Intersection of an intersection pala. Diba sa intersections, there are a lot of roads. Intersection, especially, yung common sa Philippines ay 4. Siyempre, grabe naman yung 8 intersection, di ba? Parang ang weird naman nun. 4. And these intersections, these are the roads, this is the point where the roads meet. And in our view of intersectionality, we must view it like that because these are the ways in which multiple forms of discrimination, such as based on gender, race, sexuality, disability, and class, overlap and interact with one another to shape how different individuals and groups experience discrimination. So, ang discrimination, hindi lang siya nag-exist because of your gender. It also happens because of your race, your disability, your class. So, yun, we can look at that as something like that, na hindi lang gender ang nagde-determine ng pagkatao mo because there are also social dimensions that you have to consider. And for instance, people in South Africa are discriminated because of their race, because of their economic class, because of, for instance, if you're a gay, if you're black, if you're if you belong to the lowest of the low in the socio-economic class, then you are highly discriminated by the society because of these dimensions. So, hindi lang dapat gender yung ginagawa nating pagtingin sa ating lipunan. When we look at this, intersectionality, we should consider the following. While all women are subject to gender discrimination in one way or another, it is not just gender but also race, socioeconomic class, and other factors as stated a while ago, which shape their experiences of discrimination, marginalization, and oppression. Um, With this, we can say that a black woman from Africa, for instance, is more prone or more at risk of being discriminated than a white woman in America. An individual's particular experience of intersecting discriminations is unique. It is not simply the sum of different discriminations. As a political movement, feminism must tackle all forms of discrimination and oppression, whether based on gender, race, or class. So the second topic of this discussion on gender and society will be feminism. And that's because of how women are treated in society. And of course, it's based on the idea of intersectionality. It's not just about gender now, it's also about several dimensions. As stated by Sharples, ayan, women's particular experiences of violence and discrimination are the result of multiple expressions. It's not just about gender inequalities are a result of not just their gender but also of their race, sexuality, ability, age, social class, case, appearance, marital status or position as a citizen, indigenous person, refugee, or asylum seeker. All these things contribute to the discrimination of an individual. Ayan. We have created here a framework. Ayan. Ito yung mga dimensions na aside from gender and nag-create ng inequality sa mundo natin. And we have to look into that as well. And yan, sa description na ito, sa picture na ito, we can say that all of them are prone to discrimination because they are women. However, there are there are women here who are more prone to oppression, to marginalization because of other social factors like their economy, their race, the color of their skin, their ethnicity, yun, all of those things aside from being a woman. And that's what I was talking about a while ago with this example of women. So, in this lecture, I highlighted the difference and relationship between sex and gender, and then I also considered how institutions contribute to gender construction. I also have had a discussion of the SOGI concepts, which are important for you, I know, because we are already living in these changing times and you need to be politically correct in talking to people, in identifying who you are as a person. You are not in this course, you are not obliged to um, identify yourself as someone. It's a continuous process. So if you're not ready, if you're still in the process of looking for yourself, it doesn't really matter as long as you take into consideration the concepts that we've learned from this class. So thank you so much. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask in our group chat or just comment here your questions. If you have point of clarifications, you can also send me here. Or if you're struggling with the public or your classmates looking at it, then you can send me a personal DM as well. So I hope you're having a good day, bad day tuloy, and I hope to see you very soon. Thank you.